Hello, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. My guest today is Jason G. Greene, a former senior Obama White House official, co-founder of SkillSmart, CEO of Evergreen LBS, storyteller, and the author of Too Precious to Lose, a memoir of family, community, and possibility. And Jason, I am so glad that you're here today. You know, the story that you tell is so moving, you know, and I love any story about a grandmother, being one, of course, you know, and I love the way she celebrated in this, you know, in your book. But first, tell us about being at the Obama White House. You must have been like 12, right?
I'll take that,
okay.
Absolutely. Carol, first, just such a pleasure to be with you.
Oh.
Thank you for having me on the show, and thank you for the way in which you use your platform to support Black authors, Black activists, and creatives. Just so appreciative of this opportunity to be in conversation with you and get to talk about my grandmother and this book, Too Precious to Lose. But happy to talk about my time serving our forever president. I was 12, I'll absolutely take that. I served for 4.5 years, but in total, 6 years. I was National Voter Registration Director. I served the Obama for America campaign for 2 years before we elected him to be first Black president. And then I served in the White House Counsel's office for 4 years, trying to jumpstart the economy after the Great Recession and really, you know, that's actually where you mentioned that I started SkillSmart.
Right.
So much of that came from us trying to put policies in place to stimulate the economy and put people back to work after all the things that were happening around the Great Recession.
Right, right. So you were there in the midst of trying to solve the economic problems of an entire country and the first Black president of the United States. And you get a phone call that says, things are happening at home, your grandmother needs you.
Yeah, I'm almost embarrassed at that time. So if you go back to 2013, to your point, I had spent 6 years on this kind of pursuit of self-importance, if you will, wanting to make history, but I had gone off to Yale Law School. I had spent 2 years working on the Obama campaign. I spent 4 years in the Obama White House. And Carol, I hadn't been home in some time, and that's saying something when home is only 35 miles away. So I got a call from my mother, which I'm embarrassed to say. I sent the first call to voicemail, right?
I think mothers are used to that, right?
Oh, good.
Okay.
And my mother is determined. I actually was talking to my mother on the walk over here, but my mother then called the White House switchboard and got patched through to me. I saw it coming through my desk phone, and what she relayed, Carol, was that my then 95-year-old grandmother was sick and in the hospital, and that this was an opportunity for me to come home and spend some time with her.
Right, right. And you said yes, just like that? I mean, that, now after Yale and the White House, I mean, these are pretty heady things, you know, and to get the notice that, you know, no, you're needed back at the family home to spend time.
I don't think I thought that in the first instance that this was a fork in the road moment. I don't think I thought that I'd be leaving the Obama administration. I was showing up on a Sunday afternoon to sit with my beloved grandmother. The way I grew up in Quince Orchard, my grandparents lived at the top of our street, we lived at the bottom, and we had cousins and aunts and uncles all strewn in between. So I had a very close relationship with my grandparents. I got dropped off there before and after school. And what I learned when I ended up in this hospital facility with my grandmother, then at 95, was that that's where she used to take me when I was 5 years old.
Huh.
On Tuesdays and Thursdays,
right.
She volunteered there,
right.
And so I volunteered there. Right?
Oh, that's
how it worked. And so imagine
you were going to take your child to work.
Take your grandchild to work day.
Right, right.
And so I would be with my grandmother watching her sit with people late in life, you know, in rooms I didn't want to walk into, that were uncomfortable and smelled funny, and I knew I'd get my chubby cheeks pinched.
Right.
But I remember asking her once, I was probably 5 years old, I said, why do we have to go in here? You know, I'm 5 years old. What can I do? I can't help this person. And my grandmother said, we're not here to save someone, we're here to serve someone. And she showed me what service was, how you could show up and be a witness and be present. And she gave the daily devotional and read the upper room and gave the ice chip. And it showed me how you can make someone's life better by being present. And so in that moment, I said, okay, God, I see what you're asking of me here. You want me to go and sit with her and be witness to her in the same way that I watched her give others this gift of dignity late in life. And that's the point where I decided that maybe these 6 years of self-importance, you know, that I might be on a different path to find new and powerful history in her room.
And it did change your life. I mean, you then wound up with this wonderful book and with a story of your own story, actually, that you didn't know about, your history.
It's funny you frame it that way, Carol. I like to say that I was running around the White House. I think I got my White House job when I was 27 years old.
Right.
And I was running around the White House trying to get people to listen to me. And I don't know that I really had that much to say. Huh. And so to your point on capturing my own story, this gave me my foundation. Right. It forced me to slow down, to take the time to sit and learn the stories and the history and really put myself at my grandmother's knee. And it gave me my foundation.
But the story that she had, now that is remarkable, that she not only told you the story, but also told you to go do the research and do your book.
Well,
right?
Grandma said go to the stacks.
Right.
You're absolutely right. And I think it wasn't just that she was trying to shoo me out of her hospital room. I think genuinely she had a vision on what our work was. And what was really special about this experience together was our relationship even, transformed. From grandmother and grandson. By the end of this, she would ask me, how's our project coming along?
I know. Your collaborators are actually, right,
collaborators
on this story.
Absolutely. And probably there were two components of the story that got me so excited that I ultimately ended up leaving the administration. One was how my great-great-grandparents, right, our ancestors, post-emancipation, shortly after freedom, pooled together $54 to buy 3 acres of land in rural Gaithersburg, right, this community of Quince Orchard, to build the Black church, to build the one-room schoolhouse, to build the social hall, and lay the ground for the cemetery. That blew my mind that they had that communal spirit and capacity in 1868. And then 100 years later, my grandmother, in 1968, in that same Black church that those ancestors founded, now had to decide, with a church that didn't have the resources to sustain itself, how would it proceed? Would it merge? Would it continue on its own pathway? They had that very difficult conversation to think about continued existence, right? And think about survival and how they were going to bridge the future.
So you did a film about this before the book, and we have a clip. Maybe this is a good time to take a look at that and talk on the other side.
Fantastic.
Gather this day for our soul's hunger for home. But what happens when that location no longer exists? My family's hometown of Quince Orchard doesn't appear on the map anymore.
Quince Orchard was just a drive-through country town.
We were a close-knit community.
People knew each other. They looked out for each other's children.
I started to hear all of these stories about fellowshipping with neighbors and friends, worshiping at church. And I started to forget that these folks were living in a segregated society.
It was very difficult to explain that you could have playmates, but when it came time to go to school, you went to your segregated school.
It made me feel that I wasn't equal.
This small rural community had 3 Methodist churches, 1 Black, 2 white, divided generations earlier over the issue of slavery.
We did not talk about slavery. I think it was too hard to talk about.
Read that document and tell us what it is.
This is record of slaves in Montgomery County.
Wow.
Wow. Dr. King was shot and fatally wounded.
In 1968, while riots erupted and cities burned, these 3 small churches decided to merge.
Those 3 churches, 2 white and black, decided to reconcile and to forge a new future.
Did you want the merger to happen?
I work for it. We would accept anybody that joins, regardless of race, color, or creed.
They wanted it to happen.
Oh my goodness.
There's something about erasing things in the landscape that erases it from your memory.
There's an important story that needs to be told, and we have a responsibility to make certain that it continues.
It's your blood, son. It reminds me where I come from and where I'm headed.
Really remarkable. This is the story that your grandmother told that you knew nothing about, that the fact that in 1968, but crucially, when the very night that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the 2 white churches and the colored church, as the word seems used at the time, decided to join together, even though they were in a segregated area.
I remember being in my grandmother's hospital room, and she's telling me this story about these 3 racially segregated churches in the community that I grew up in. Okay, so I obviously came generations later, but in the place that I knew. And she starts working up her crescendo to talk about what's going to happen on that fateful night, April 4th, 1968. And she starts to say, and the churches, and I said, they didn't merge, did they? And she says, Jason, of course they merged. You grew up in the progeny church. You grew up in the merged church. And Carol, what struck me about that was that something about the politics and the polarization, like the reality of the life that I've lived, I didn't see it. I didn't think that it would happen. I didn't think that people would sit at the table and figure it out. I thought they would say, this is too hard. There's an opportunity for us to push back to the table and say, not right now. And so that's part of why I wanted to dig into this process, because I think too often we would say, that's not something that I have the capacity to do right now. And so their ability to think about survival and how do we preserve and continue to exist, and then obviously the motivation that came with Dr. King's assassination, injecting a whole nother dimension. What would Martin do? Right into this conversation is something that I wanted to explore, and I thought that there were lessons that we could apply from that decision.
Right. Well, you're in your author's note, you know, take up where do we go from here? Chaos or community, you know?
Yes.
Which I think is, was the question then, is the question now.
Could I read this,
Sure,
Cheryl?
absolutely.
I'd love to share. So this is my author's note. In 1967, Dr. King in his final book asked, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? For the longest time, I assumed the answer was obvious. Community. We would choose one another. We would build and progress together. That's what I was taught and grew up believing. But now I understand why Dr. King posed this prophetic question, and I worry. I worry about the rising tide of racial and political animus and how easily it turns us inward and on each other. I worry about a future rushing toward us, widening a gulf between the haves and the have-nots. I worry that profit eclipses humanity, dignity, and respect. I worry because it matters how we see each other and that we see each other. I worry because choosing community isn't as obvious as I once perhaps naively believed. Alas, almost 60 years later, most signs still point to chaos. I get it. Chaos is louder, it's faster, it gets more clicks. Community moves slowly. It demands more of us and requires grace and intention. This book is about that kind of work, the kind that makes us slow down and truly remember. It was unexpected to walk into a room, to sit by my ailing 95-year-old grandmother's side, a blessing to walk out forever changed. I wrote this book as an enduring reminder that our collective yesterdays, no matter how troubled, light our path toward better tomorrows. I choose community because some things are too precious to lose.
Right. Well, this book will help people understand community if those churches could come together and do that at that particular point where the country was in mayhem, and just good people walked through the door and said, we're going to work together and we're going to save our churches and we're going to do it together. King, though, in this book, was presenting some particular options for the country that we certainly need to pay attention to now. And since you were in the White House trying to figure out the economic solution to how we go forward, talk to us about that, because King was saying, until you fix poverty, you're not going to fix anything. Unless he felt a guaranteed income for everybody, then this country, you could do it, and we still could do it.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts in terms of going forward and where we are now in King's book, your book? What do we do?
I think you framed this perfectly, that in 1967, King was asking, where do we go from here, chaos or community, and recognizing the existential moment that the country was in. And we have to recognize that we're in a similar existential moment today. I think that's the first step is to stop looking towards the next election as the solution for some of these significant and fundamental problems that exist. Using the church example, or even going further back, I think that those two stories operate in balance. The first being the decision to even the decision to even found the community of Pleasant View. In 1868, 3 years after emancipation, my great-great-grandparents and other members of that community with little to no resources pulled together $54. Right? Communally, pulled it together to decide that they were going to purchase 3 acres of land and build the schoolhouse, the church, at Cemeterial Plot. What was so powerful about that is that someone like me, who sort of has all the blessings of having gone to Yale Law School and to sit in the Obama administration, when I heard that story, I got to ask all of the optional questions. I got to say, well, wasn't there a safer way? Wasn't there a less conspicuous way? If you wanted to educate black children, was it the wisest to build a building on the main drag, paint it white, and say, we're educating, to your point, colored children here? And I remember having that conversation with my grandmother where she said in response to me, Jason, there was no public education for black children. Your great-great-grandparents, those other men and women, looked around their community, they saw a need, and they took action because they were doers and doers do. It was a simple but profound statement that said that these challenges that exist in our communities are real, and we have a responsibility to face them and a responsibility to sort of bring our ideas and our communal spirit and our resilience to the fore. And so when we think about the challenges that are facing us in the same vein today, where you have an effort to sow chaos, to distract, to diminish some of the values that we espouse in our policies, we have the same responsibility to not be distracted by those things, to recognize that there are significant challenges that the country's facing. The wave that's coming from artificial intelligence is going to affect our communities. You're talking about some of the economic inequalities that exist. Those are only going to be increased significantly by the advent of artificial intelligence and the disruption in our workforce. And so step one is to acknowledge the existential moment that we are in. Step two is to then start to think about some of these innovation policies. In the book, what we talk about is the merger itself was innovation. It was an idea about what assets do we have? What liabilities do we have? Which partnerships can we forge so that we might have a lasting relationship? And then the third piece of that is, what is the actual objective then? And how do we work in pursuit of that objective, even putting our own personal egos on the shelf to make sure that the overall objective is actually being pursued? And so thinking through these sort of challenges with that kind of a framework, I think, is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I want us to go back and be nostalgic and feel warm in stories with my grandmother, but I want us to put that book into action.
Right. But you also, speaking of action, have worked in the reparations field, chair of the Reparations Commission in Montgomery County, right?
So my home county, where Quince Orchard or Gaithersburg, and you see the evolution of this town. When my grandmother and my father grew
Maryland,
up,
we should say.
Rural Maryland, Upper Montgomery County.
Right.
When I grew up, it was Gaithersburg. Now this part of that area is called North Potomac, and you see those sorts of evolutions and those fights happening all across the country.
Right.
And I chaired Montgomery County's commission. I'm still a commissioner on the Remembrance and Reconciliation Commission, which in part in response to some of Brian Stevenson's work, where he's lifted up a period of American history where we had, during the Reconstruction era, racial terror lynchings.
Equal Justice Institute in Montgomery, Brian Stevenson.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
That's absolutely right. And he's brought to light that work, racial terror lynchings that terrorized black communities across the country through the Reconstruction era. And so one of the things that we've been working on there is realizing that history is not history and it's not fully written. So how do we write a fuller and more accurate history? And then what do we do with that? Right? So there were 3 men that were lynched in Montgomery County, one of which was through the Quince Orchard community, and so that's the nexus in which I write about it in the book. But Montgomery County hasn't ever grappled with that history. That these were I talk about community as a force for good. These were actions of community that were a force for bad, right? These were communal acts to terrorize Black communities in Montgomery County, in Maryland, and across the country. And so one point from that work that we're trying to articulate is that we can't jump to the reconciliation work, Carol. It's often where people want to pull up the chair and say, okay, how do we just solve it? And we realize that the truth is a necessary conduit to ever getting to the reconciliation. So we have to have a fuller truth, a fuller accounting, a fuller history. And in so doing, we can be on that winding path towards reconciliation, but without it, we won't get there.
And how do you do that, though? I mean, are people willing to talk? You know, we've just had, globally, an understanding that slavery was a crime. Is that the language that they're using?
It's pretty amazing. Someone said to me, it feels sometimes like we're fighting the fights of the 60s. And I said the 1860s, right? It feels that way sometimes. And why are we having to do this? And I think sometimes there's that exhaustion. Like, I don't want to have to fight my grandparents' fights. And I think that part of the point here in telling some of these stories is to build that resilience, to make sure people know that we've been here before and we're going to keep being here, that there is not a mountaintop moment, right? We don't overcome, there will only be overcoming. It's an active process that requires continued investment and intention. There's one story from the book that I'll share that kind of represents this. My uncle, Tompkins, my grandmother's kid brother, who is now 102.
And by the way, your grandmother lived quite, 11 years beyond the 95?
Yeah, she passed it, she passed 2 months shy of 107.
Wow. So, but she got you out of the White House. She got you out of D.C. anyway.
Yeah, she got me back. She knew what she was doing. She got me back. And in so doing, she would also encourage me to connect with other members of the family. My uncle being one of them, who still lives in D.C., travels the hour out to Quince Orchard twice a week, once for church, once for choir practice. And I asked him once why, and he said because it was important for them to see my face in the Integrated Sanctuary Choir in 1968, and it's just as important today. And that sort of intention, that sort of dedication to this idea, I found to be amazing and representative of the same sort of intention that we want to give to these issues.
We just had a picture up. Oh, look at this. Yeah. Your grandmother, how old was she then?
This was 95. I was able to spring her out of the hospital and there's a funny story, Carol, where my grandmother was very proud. And so when we wheeled her into the Oval Office, she wanted to meet the first Black president standing up. And so she started to try and get out of her wheelchair, but the president very much wanted her to stay in her wheelchair. So for like 2 or 3 minutes, they're in this push of war where she's trying to get out. And he keeps pushing her back in. And there you have it when they're meeting each other for the first time.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. You know, what a nexus of history. And I think that exactly what you've done in this book is what every Black family needs to do, is to go back and especially now that so much is being erased and banned, that telling the stories, creating them for ourselves is essential.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, Carol. And I think that we tell the history in iconic figures, and we need the personal stories to fill in the gaps and to tell a fuller story. And I would say to your viewers, you don't have to write a book, right? Lower the pressure. But I got the good fortune of a wake-up call. I was not on this trajectory. I got a wake-up call to do it. Now this is everyone else's wake-up call. Don't wait for the moment. Make the moment to sit with your ancestors. Because on this book tour, I hear from so many folks that say, I was supposed to do that. I was supposed to sit with my mother, my grandmother, my great-aunt, and they passed away with all the stories. And so all the folks that we interviewed in Quince Orchard, we sat down with them, we took the notes. Sometimes we interviewed them on camera. Many have passed away. We share that with their families. And often, Carol, that hour interview is the most comprehensive accounting of their life that their families have. And so I just encourage people to do this. I know that I want people to walk away with the book feeling something, but I can say without equivocation that I am better because I got to sit with my grandmother. I'm better because I got to sit with 80 other people and wrestle with their stories, understand them, and be a better family member, be a better descendant, hopefully be a better ancestor, but better because of the experience.
Right. And I will say, because of work being done in our family, is that, and you mentioned AI, we cannot guarantee that everything is truthful, but there really seems to be an astonishing amount of information accessible for families.
So much of this story was hiding in plain sight.
Right.
You know that I went back and started doing the archival research. We didn't know our slavery story. I thought maybe it would be in Montgomery, Alabama.
Right.
And it turned out to be right there in Montgomery County, Maryland, miles away from where I grew up, and only that was available right there in the archives in Maryland State House. It was all there.
Right.
I just needed to go and actually access it, go and do the work and get it in the stack. So those resources are there for those that want to pursue them.
Right, right. And so you're a changed person. I'm glad I shouldn't say it, but I'm glad we did get you out of D.C. and tell us what you're doing now.
It's one
in
of those,
addition to being a great author and on book tour and being very successful in that.
the book tour is trying to bring this message around change. I think it's so important right now where I think you framed that incredibly well, where we think sometimes that change comes from Washington, but it comes to Washington. We need to show ideas, we need to show coalitions, we need to show how it can be done. I spend a lot of time still thinking about how we build more resilient communities. I've had the good fortune to be able to do that in different ways, as a lawyer, as an author, as a filmmaker, as an entrepreneur. SkillSmart is a company that's thinking about workforce. How do we put people in jobs, and how do we create jobs in a way that's connected and resilient? And I've also been a venture capitalist trying to invest in change makers so that they have the resources that can really exponentially grow tremendous ideas. So I just feel so blessed to be able to try and build strong and resilient communities in different ways.
Well, thank you so much for Too Precious to Lose. The book is wonderful. You tell it very well. And I'm so glad that you spent the time with your grandmother. Your grandmother got to meet President Obama. And that you're doing this fantastic work in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for being with us today.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm so blessed.
Former senior White House official and author of Too Precious to Lose, a memoir of family, community, and possibility. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Carol.
And that's it for us at this time. Thank you for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America, and we'll see you the next time. You're great.
Thank you. Hopefully I went where you wanted me.
No.